right, let's have some fun today, I suppose. It's not. I told Jillian yesterday. It's not often you get the chance to preach on Revelation, and it just so happens that these sorts of things are going on in the news at the same time. I did not plan this in any way, shape, or form. I did not have advanced intelligence that this was coming, but I will run with it anyway. The text of Revelation 12 I have found to be the hardest of all of the chapters in Revelation thus far. It is probably the hardest in the entire book, because if you know anything about texts that use symbols, one of the challenges of using symbolism is trying to understand and identify what it is symbolizing, what is the author's intent and interpretation. And the challenge to that is that this text has generally a combination of two problems at face value. One is it is entirely symbolic throughout basically the entire book, or the entire chapter here, in the sense that a lot of things are referencing images or signs of something, which we'll get into a second here. And then the other problem is it doesn't really give you symbols of things consistently that we have a direct interpretation of. Some things we can take a really good educated guess at, but they don't seem to, at least at face value, have a way to answer them. And so that's been my difficulty with symbolism, and my challenge has always been to people who treat all of this as symbolism is to say, all right, well, how do you know what it means? If it's all purely symbolic, then your guess is as good as mine, and therefore it effectively becomes somewhat useless to us. And I didn't want to do that to this chapter, but I also didn't want to skip over anything, because if I say, well, this may be this or that, and then we do that to an entire chapter, that doesn't seem to be appropriate. And so this text is challenging enough as it is, and I have not been studying this text for the last week or the last 2 weeks. I have been going at this one for years, poking away at it, trying to find if I'm missing something, or if there is something of substance to it. And in all my time of studying Revelation, this has been the chapter that I have been, I don't want to say dreading, but more intimidated by. But I think I have finally worked out a good explanation behind what these symbols mean and what they are here for. But obviously we have a sort of elephant in the room as we address this sort of thing, because we have conflict in Israel as of 48 hours ago. We have things that seem to demand explanation, and this text doesn't necessarily give us a direct explanation behind what we see in the news, and I'm not going to be one of those people who will go and look at the news and then come back to the text and reinterpret it. But that doesn't mean then that no text can help us understand things we see today either. But to understand this chapter, you have to first understand that we are changing course. The layout of Revelation is an interesting one, and in this case, we are changing scene. We are changing the thematic, as it were, because if you remember from the previous chapter, we had covered the two witnesses and the introduction of the temple and what the two witnesses accomplish, and then the blowing of the seventh and final trumpet and the declaration of the kingdom of God arriving, and everything seems to reach a sort of peak, and then we suddenly take a break, and we are now changing the scene. So if you were to put yourself in John's shoes, one of the things to remember about this book is that John is seeing these things. He's not simply being told them and writing them down. He wasn't told at the beginning, write down what you are told. He is told to write down what you see. And so if you follow this narrative, and you've been following John all the way from chapter 4 into chapter 11, he's been moved from one spot to the next, and now here he is, standing probably somewhere in heaven itself, watching the seventh trumpet has been blown, and everybody is declaring that victory has arrived. And then his direction is refocused upwards. He looks up, as it were, into the sky, and images appear. And that's different. That's what makes this text partially a challenge. This text is faced with quite a few challenges, and to give you a quick sample of them so you can slightly appreciate the challenges I have faced over the while I've been studying through this, here are some examples. First, we have a woman who is in labor with a child, and she has 12 stars on her head, and this is not a source of any small amount of debate Who is the woman? What does she represent? What are the 12 stars? Is this the church and the 12 apostles? Is this Israel and the 12 tribes? Is this Mary, as the Catholics have very quickly declared? If it is Israel, at what point was she taken to her place in the wilderness away from the devil for 3.5 years twice, especially right after the child ascends? Who is the male child? If it's Christ, why not just say that? On top of that, if it is Christ, it completely omits his earthly ministry and skips from his birth to his ascension instantly. And if it's not Christ, then who in the world could it possibly be to be born who the devil wants to destroy, who will also rule the nations with a rod of iron, and who was caught up to God and to his throne? No one has ascended into heaven except the one who had descended, which is the Son of Man. So if this is not him, then who else could it be? We have two events which occur in which the woman is taken to her place in the wilderness, where she stays for 1,260 days, and then again for a time times and half a time. And this happens twice. It doesn't say it once, it happens twice. And if you're an eschatological student, that number, not only the amount of time of 3.5 years should stand out, but the way it's described. One moment it's 1,260 days, and the next is time times and half a time, and which is which, and what time frames are they looking at, and where was she taken, and why was she taken there, and why not longer, why not less? While the second mention of a time times and half a time could be explained as a future event, such as the Great Tribulation, the first one is much harder to narrow down, as contextually this event occurs after the child is caught up into heaven, but before there is war in heaven. And of course the obvious issue of what is symbolic and what is literal. There is obviously an excessive amount of symbolism used here, but to what extent? And how do we know when it is symbolism and when it isn't? When do we start? When do we stop? How do we interpret it? How do you know for sure what it represents? And why is this chapter in the middle of the book and not the beginning? In other words, what is the point? If you're John and you have finally arrived at the point you have been waiting for, the Great Tribulation is reaching its climax, and heaven is celebrating the arrival of the kingdom of Christ, and the last trumpet is being blown, the trumpet which Paul himself wrote about as the beginning of the resurrection, and you think, great, we're about to see it, and then someone says, hey, John, look over here. Watch this. You think, well, why? What would be the point of that? And then John sees this display, which perhaps confused him, because again, John is not explaining what he sees, he is writing what he sees. So why is this here? If this is in reference to the birth of Christ, then why bring this up halfway through the book about his second coming? And on top of that, many believe that Satan was already cast out of heaven a long time ago when he rebelled against God, so why would it be happening again? If this depiction of the devil being cast to the earth and war in heaven and rebellion of the angels is a past event, that would seem to indicate that this is occurring after the birth of Christ and not before, and so that doesn't work with a lot of Christian mythology. And if this is in reference to a past event, why does it occur after the birth of the male child if that is in reference to Christ? So the point being that there's a lot of presupposed narratives that we have that are challenged by this chapter. A lot of views that are concluded kind of run into a brick wall here, and no matter what position you take, whether you're full-on preterist or you're full-on dispensational, there are problems that you run into here. There are questions of timing, and how do we orient these, and where do we put them, and how do we answer them? And if you answer a question one way, you run into a problem another way. So there's all kinds of problems that you run into here. And reading through the commentators, you will find that that persists even with them. The best and the brightest run into problems here. So this is the challenge. So, in case you think, well, I think I might know the obvious answers, let's just read through the whole chapter. Chapter 12, verse 1. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. And behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male, who is to rule all of the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation, and the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb, and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life, even when faced with death. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who had given birth to the male. But the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time, and from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Now, if you think, wow, that all makes perfect sense, I know exactly what everything means. I don't believe you. This imagery, you might think, all right, well, I get half of it until about partway through when the dragon's suddenly spitting out water and the earth is swallowing it. This just seems a little weird. So we will break this down into 3 parts. The first part, which we will deal with today, goes from verse 1 all the way up to verse 6. So we will deal with the signs initially appearing, the woman giving birth, the male being born, the dragon not being able to get to him, and the woman being taken into her place the first time. That is where we will begin today. So let's answer some questions. The first question, why is this in the middle of Revelation? Why put this chapter here? Why not earlier? Why not start with, hey, here's what happened in the past, and then we'll get to the future? Well, let's look at the layout of Revelation. Revelation 1 through 3 is the introduction and purpose of the book and the 7 letters to the 7 churches. So it's kind of laying the groundwork theologically for where John was at the time he received the vision, the reason he is being given the vision, and the whole purpose of why we have it. And then the letter is being given to the churches, which would be distributed to the 7 churches along with the Revelation. Then in chapters 4 through 11, which is where we last ended, is a chronological order of events which lead up to the day of the Lord, as well as the events which will occur in the day of the Lord from the perspective of heaven. And this is important, and I've talked about this before, but when you go through eschatological texts, whether that's Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, Revelation, etc., each one is occurring from a different point of view or a different reason it's being given, all looking at the same event. So if you were to look at the 4 Gospels, each of the 4 Gospels are looking at the same sequence of events from different points of view. And that's the way eschatology works. Only Revelation is unique in that it takes John into heaven and he follows everything that's happening from the perspective of heaven. So he's looking from the top down. And from chapters 4 through 11, he's been up there, moving around as he's been dictated to, and being shown different things. So when the seals of wrath or when the seals are being brought in the book before the Lamb, and the declaration is made as to why the Lamb is allowed to break them, and what happens when they're broken, and the horsemen going out and coming back, and then the trumpets being blown. These are all things that John is being shown from heaven. But then we get to chapters 12 through 14, and we've changed perspective. So 4 through 11 is a chronological list of events of all the things happening to the earth from the point of view of heaven until we reach the peak at which Christ is about to appear and we stop. And the chart I handed out last time shows that that process seems to repeat itself at least 3 times. You get all the way up to the point right before Christ appears, you announce that he's arrived, or he's about to come and his kingdom has arrived, and then you stop and you change perspective and you re-explain something else, and you stop and right as you get to that point and go back and explain something else. And so 4 through 11, chronological events. Then, chapters 12 through 14, we break from the chronological order of events with the purpose to explain something else, including the dragon's conflict with the woman, as seen here, and the nature of the beast in Revelation 13, and a few other specifics which will be addressed later. So, effectively, what this imagery is going to be used to do is to give us insight into something. So here John has been shown a sort of quick overview of a sequence of events from heaven's perspective, and right before we get to the climax, he's effectively told, stop, we need to explain something else to you. So you've seen all of that, take a break, look over here, we've got to show you something else. We're going to elaborate on something. So chapters 12 through 14 breaks the chronological order and starts to demonstrate the context behind the dragon and the beast and so on. Then chapters 15 through 16, a new sign appears to reiterate the victory of God and the day of the Lord, the doom for his enemies, and the explanation of the 7 bowls of wrath. So it kind of adds a little bit more to the chronological event, but gives you a reason as to why. Then chapters 17 through 18, another scene appears, which is meant to explain the history and the fate of Babylon and her relation to the beast. And then finally, at that point, we've stopped going backwards, and we get into chapters 19 through 20, where the announcement of Christ's victory is once again reiterated, the second coming is actually seen, and the judgment of the beasts and the imprisonment of the devil, as well as the introduction of the millennial kingdom and the subsequent judgment afterwards, all arrive, including the great white throne. So at that point, we then pick back up with chronology, and we move forward and finish it. And then in chapters 21 through 22, the new heaven, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, as well as the final message to the readers of the book of Revelation are seen. So that's the general order of Revelation. So we start this chapter with a word that has perhaps been misconstrued or misunderstood. It says a great sign appeared in heaven. And the word sign is an interesting one because you might think, well, signs and wonders, something of hot debate even in the modern age as to what we mean by that. And you might think, well, miraculous signs, healings, and so on. And that is included in the definition of a sign. But the actual word itself can be used a few different ways. The word can be used for miracles, like signs and wonders. It can be used as a marker or a token of something. So, for example, when Isaiah, or you get the message from Isaiah, and he's being told, a sign will be given to you, a woman will be with child. A virgin will give birth to a son. It was a sign. It was an indication of something, as well as being miraculous. And it's also a means of assurance. It was a sign given as a guarantee. So you could simplify the word down to the word contrast. In other words, something that is meant to stand out. That for example, the debate over whether or not Isaiah meant that a virgin would have a child or just a woman in general, well, if a woman in general was going to have a child, that wouldn't be very unique. But if a virgin was to give birth to a child, that would be a sign. It would be contrasting with reality as we understand it. It would be a break from the normal. So it could be seen as a contrast. It could be a person, it could be a thing, or it can be an event which stands out and is meant to be seen to direct our attention to something in particular, like a traffic sign. It is extremely reflective and is designed to contrast with its surroundings. If a traffic sign blended in and didn't stand out, it wouldn't be very useful. And its purpose is to let the drivers know something important. The reason you have a bright reflective stop sign is to tell them to stop. A harsh turn coming up, it wants you to know, especially if it's dark and you have headlights. The idea is this is designed to basically act as a sort of flare, a contrast, something to catch your attention, to indicate and lead you to something. These signs, which Jesus performed, were things which stood out among the events of everyday life. So, for example, blindness turned to sight, the lame walking again, the dead living again, etc. These are things that they would otherwise have viewed as permanent, but all of a sudden they're changing course. You say it went from natural to supernatural. And these were meant to direct the people to what he was saying. In this case, the signs pointed to him as being the way to eternal life. So Jesus didn't just come and declare the truth. He performed things that made it undeniable who was telling this to them to get their attention. In fact, it's generally consistent that any time new revelation was being given from God to men, signs would accompany it. Not because the sign themselves were the point, but because it was as a sort of validation for the person talking. So when Moses comes and tells the Egyptians to let the people go, he doesn't just sign a petition. He goes up and he begins performing the signs and wonders of God that he would unleash on Egypt until eventually Pharaoh finally lets them go. And God then reminds the Israelites, remember these signs that were given, remember who did this. It was to stand out and to direct them to what was being said. In this particular text, the use of signs is to direct our attention to something new. John was watching the events from the previous text unfold, and upon their completion, his attention is directed upwards to the sky where he will see these signs. This is almost like a sort of play, wherein the signs he sees are events and characters involved in the play. This play has the purpose of explaining something important as it relates to these events John has just seen and the events which will take place after them. So this is not random. This is not for no apparent reason. The reason these signs will appear is to explain something to John that has something to do with either what he has seen or is about to see. These signs are not just small signs, though. There is a word that precedes it. He doesn't just say, and a sign appeared in heaven. He says, and a great sign appeared in heaven, a mega sign, a sign that could not be ignored. So there's John, and he's been watching all of these things occur in heaven, and something massive appears in the sky. It is clearly meant to draw his attention to a couple of factors, meaning that these were both massive in scale, so they were filling the sky above him, and they were massive in their meaning and implications. These are not small things to overlook and are meant to narrow the attention of the reader to something important. And so, in other words, if they were massive, if they were mega to John, both in what they looked like and what they meant and their implications, then it should be significant to us as well. If these are mega signs given from God, then we have to pay attention to them, and we can't just simply say, well, it's too much symbolism, who knows what it means, it's not really relevant anyway. The use of the word mega is effectively removing your excuse to ignore it. This massive play in the sky will cover historical events and will go all the way into the future to explain something vital. So, that's the sign. The play is being demonstrated. Some demonstration of an important thing is being brought to John's attention, and it is huge. Now, who are the characters in this play? This is where we start to get into some specifics. But in order to understand who the dragon is, which is pretty self-explanatory, I don't really have to go into much detail on that. He's obviously said he is the serpent of old and the devil, so we know who that is. But in order to understand who the woman is this the church? Is this Israel? We need to understand who the male child is. We have to first determine his identity to make sense of the woman's identity. Now, I'm not going to spend a great amount of time on this, but to kind of reiterate what was going on, let me grab a nice contrasty color here. We have a woman in labor. I will tell you out of the gate, I tried a few different ways to draw this out, and it looked silly and stupid, and so I decided to get the help of someone who can actually draw, which would be Becky. So I'm not in any way interested in drawing a woman giving birth. Nobody needs to see that. That's not the point here. The point is that she is going to give birth to a male child. So we will symbolize that with a circle. And we will just say, here's our child. So she gives birth to the male child, and she's in labor with this child at this point. And that's where we begin the sign. That's where we begin the play. She's not going to be in labor. She is actively in labor. She is in pain, and she is crying out, being in pain, because the child is about to be born. So she's about to give birth to the child, and the dragon is hanging out waiting for the child to be born. He's waiting to destroy this child. Something about this child stands out that mandates the dragon destroy him. He has no desire for this child to ever make it. So he's waiting for that to appear. So the first character here is the male child. Now, to understand the male child, we need to take what is said about him and keep it in its context. You don't want to go so far into speculation that you miss the point. One of the rules that I generally try to abide by in interpretation is if not much is said about something, then not much is meant to be said about that something. And that sounds very simple, but it really helps make sense of stuff. So, for example, you could spend a very long time debating back and forth as to who this is. And you say, well, it's obvious, it's Christ. But then I can say, okay, we counter that. I'll give you some of the dilemmas I was facing. If that is Christ, why not say it? Why not say, and she gave birth to the Messiah? I mean, we know that Israel was going to have the Messiah born among them, so why not just say it? That was the big burning question in my head, is why phrase it this way? Why call it a child and not just Messiah? And then on top of that, though when you first read this text, you think, well, she gives birth, and the dragon's waiting for her to have given birth so he can destroy the child. But it seems the dragon is unable to do it because the child is caught up to God and to his throne. Now, if you know the Christmas account, you know that after Mary gave birth to Christ, he was not immediately caught up into heaven. He would go on for another 30 years, give or take, before finally being crucified, and then rising again, and then ascending himself. So how does that make sense within this context? Well, we are given a clear answer into this, but for a reason that we might not find satisfactory at first. This has to be, undeniably, and I don't think there's much reason otherwise to say, this has to be Christ. And there's a few reasons for that. The first and most obvious reason as to why this is Christ is because he is to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Now, the challenge I originally had to that was that if you go back to the 7 letters to the churches, we are told that the one who overcomes will also rule the nations with a rod of iron. But that is more in a sort of plural sense, in that you would have multiples. But here it's identifying down to one male child born of a woman. And it's narrowing the focus down to this one guy who would himself rule the nations with the rod of iron, something explicitly stated regarding the Christ who was coming. For example, in Revelation 19, when we get to his actual arrival, it is again stated that he will rule the nations with a rod of iron. But let's read a couple other explanations behind this. So, the first one, let's go to Psalm chapter 2. And we will have a few of these, and I really want to set this context correctly because this will help make sense, I think, of what is going on here. Psalm chapter 2, and we'll kind of just fly through it here, because Psalm 2, in context, will help make sense of certain things. So, Psalm chapter 2, starting at verse 1. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. And the word anointed there would be the word Christ, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell you the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give you the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession, and you shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall shatter them like earthenware. Therefore, O kings, show discernment, and take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all those who take refuge in him. So what's interesting about that text is it almost speaks as the birth of the Messiah as daunting. It is a warning given. It's not a message of salvation. It is a message of warning. That all you kings and rulers of the earth take notice because God himself has begotten a son who will rule the nations and break them. The rod of iron is not a gently prodding rod. It is meant to shatter. It is meant to break things. In this case, break the nations. And so you would say, all right, why is he described, why is this male child described in this way, in this particular text? And because what we are looking at is a text, a play, a demonstration of conflict, a conflict of authority and a conflict of power. And so when the male child of Christ is introduced, he is not introduced as salvation. He is not introduced simply as the Christ or the Anointed One. He is introduced as the Son who will break the nations. And this is also to help narrow our focus. There's another text, though, that we can help explain this. One you will know, hopefully well, and that is in Isaiah chapter 9. And Isaiah chapter 9 is known as a text you would probably read around Christmas. But in Isaiah chapter 9, starting at verse 1, and what I thought was fascinating, I just have to tell you this because I just thought it was cool. As I'm reading this text, I have up on my screen, right above it, the live stream, because I was paying attention to the stuff going on in Israel at the time, and one of the cameras was overviewing Jerusalem and Bethlehem in the West Bank. And I just thought, that is something else. Here we have attacks going against Israel, and Bethlehem is being issued warnings. And yet here we can go back so far back in time and read something that should be assuring. Verse 1, "But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later on he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine upon them. You shall multiply the nation. You shall increase their gladness. They shall be glad in your presence, as with the gladness of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you shall break the yoke of their burden and the staff on their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, as at the battle of Midian. For every boot of the booted warrior in the battle tumult and cloak rolled in blood will be for burning, fuel for the fire. For a child will be born to us. A son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. And there will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace. And on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this." So here we have the person of the Son, of the Christ, the Anointed One, and we often think, oh, he comes to die for sins, which he does. But at the same time, he also does something else. And that is something looked to especially in the future, where he will bring in justice and righteousness, and he will come in wrath. You ever wonder why when Christ shows up in chapter 19 in Revelation, he has a cloak that is dipped in blood, and he has a sword, and he comes to slay the nations. He comes to massacre them, because he is not bringing in righteousness just with some sense of mercy and comfort. He comes in dread. And it is in that context that we are looking at him here. That this child being born is a matter, is a subject, is a source of dread and terror to two people. To the nations, that he will break with a rod of iron, and especially in this context, to the dragon. So here we have the child. He's born of a woman. He will rule the nations with a rod of iron. The devil so desperately wants to destroy him, but he's not able to. And the child then is caught up to God and to his throne in heaven. He's gone. Now you say, all right, well, what about his earthly ministry? The simple answer to that question is that's not the point of this text. The point of this text is not to focus on Christ himself. Hate to break it to you, but he's not the main character here, not in this chapter. And we'll explain that in a minute. But what this is being given to us for is to explain how the dragon sees the male child. That he sees him as a threat to his power, as a threat to his nations, and the male child he seeks to devour and he's not allowed to, and so the child he can't defeat, and the child is caught up to God and to his throne. He can't touch him anymore. Certainly tried, but he's not able to. And on top of all of this, there is no other viable alternative as to who else this could be. It's just, there is none. I looked. There is no one. Then we get to our next character. See, the male child is here and gone very quickly. He's not really brought up again in this context. He's brought up to explain the relationship between the woman and the dragon and why the dragon is afraid of this male child. But the male child is born, he's caught up to God on his throne, he doesn't appear again. We won't see him later in this chapter. He'll be referenced, but we don't see him again. And we don't see him again in the next chapters at all. He doesn't appear again as this title. He's not the main character. So, let's look at the woman. Is she the main character? Who is the woman? What does she represent? Well, there are some potential answers. Every single one of my commentaries that I had access to in eSword, unfortunately, came up with the answer of the church. This is the most common answer I could find among those commentators. There are some who don't agree with that. Their reasoning reaches this conclusion entirely based on their other overall eschatological views, not because the text demands this. There is nothing in this text that demands this of the church. None. You have to have had other conclusions in your eschatology to say that this represents the church, but there's nothing here that indicates that. In fact, I would argue that there's actually something that distinguishes it. But on top of this, Christ was not born of the church. It was the other way around. Christ was born, he was on the earth for quite a while, and the many mention of the church doesn't appeal till later when he's speaking to Peter. So it really doesn't make sense that it would be explained that way. But there's another reason as to why this really wouldn't represent that. It has to be Israel, because this makes much more sense, both in the immediate context. Christ was born in Israel. He was born as a descendant of Abraham, as the rightful heir to David's throne, and that's why the Gospels of Matthew and Luke spend so much time on his genealogy, is to explain where he came from. And so he's an Israelite. And it makes sense in the bigger context of these events. We've discussed many times before, the purpose of the 70 weeks, the purpose of the day of the Lord, the great tribulation, and all these things is in part to judge the nations, and the other part is to save Israel. This is referenced in Romans 11 repeatedly. This is the reason the natural branches will be grafted back in, and all Israel will be saved. This is a promise. And so this is one of the ways that that's going to happen, and so it makes sense that the woman would represent Israel. She has a crown of 12 stars. So, I don't think you can count the dots from this distance, so we will say this represents Israel, and we have the 12 tribes seen on her crown. So here we have Israel, we have the 12 tribes, which are represented as 12 stars on her crown, to help explain who we're looking at here. But it will get even more specific. Look ahead. Chapter 12 and chapter 13 are not separate visions here. They are the same. Chapter 12 ends by carrying into chapter 13. If you know anything about Revelation 13, if you're like some dispensationalists, you might even gloss over chapter 12 to get to chapter 13, because that's where all the fun and cool stuff is at. You will have the devil showing up on the sea, and he calls up the beast from the sea, who is what many will label as the Antichrist, and from him will come the world government that is coming in the future. And then you have the beast from the earth, who enforces it and performs signs and gives life to an image of the beast and gives the mark of the beast and enforces it. But one of the things you understand about chapter 13, and again reiterated in chapter 17, is that these beasts represent something. They represent a conglomerate of nations. It says that each head represents a kingdom, and each horn represents a king or a ruler from those respective kingdoms. And they all form together into one large governing body. And so if the beast from the sea represents a governing body made up of multiple nations, which is a conglomerate of all the nations described in Daniel 7, because they look the same, now they're combined into one. So if Daniel 7 was nations, and Daniel 8 was nations using beasts, and Revelation 13 is nations representing beasts, and then we go back and we say, all right, well, the dragon has a similar description. He has 7 heads, and 7 crowns or diadems on those heads, and 10 horns on those heads. So he must also represent a national governing body, which is true, and we'll get to that. Then so does the woman. But she's got one head, and she gives birth to the male child, and so we say, all right, well, she's got one head, it's one nation, it's one kingdom, it's one person, and she has a crown of 12 stars, and so it's not much of a reach to say those represent the 12 tribes that make up the one nation. But all that to simply say that it makes sense within the context that the woman herself also represents a nation and not just simply a person. And so, all of that to say, this is almost certainly Israel, if not 100% confident. What about the moon at her feet, and she's clothed with the sun? This was an interesting one. People will say, well, the moon is at her feet representing strength and dominance. I don't know how you come up with that. That doesn't make any sense to me. It kind of sounds to me like as a rough guess, kind of throwing a dart into strength and confidence. Maybe it represents beauty. Maybe the sun is reflecting its light off of the moon. Maybe she's a reflection. You can run with that. The problem with any of those is there's no way to be sure of any of those answers because we don't have a text that explicitly tells us what the moon represents. It's just thrown in here as a detail. And she's clothed with the sun. Well, this represents her purity and radiance. Maybe, but again, your guess is as good as mine. Now, am I going to run away and say, well, this doesn't mean anything in particular? No. If I say sun, and I say moon, and I say stars, and I say Israel, this should start to ring a bell. This should ring a bell in a couple ways. Let's start with the most obvious, Genesis chapter 37. You will probably know the story. It's way back, all the way beginning of the book. You had that annoying little brother with his coat of many colors, and his brothers were jealous. And they were jealous of him progressively. It kind of builds, and it builds, and it builds, and finally they have enough of him, and they try to kill him, but they eventually all agree to be nice brothers and sell him into slavery. But before any of that happens, Joseph is given insight beforehand. Starting at, let's say, verse 9. So Joseph's been having dreams. He has the wheat that's kind of standing up and it falls over, and they're already not pleased with that dream. About verse 9, he had another dream. And he related it to his brothers and said, Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And he related it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow down ourselves before you to the ground? And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. And then we go on. Now, what's interesting is that text actually gives us some explanation, at least behind Joseph's dream. One, we know the outcome. They would. Joseph would go into Egypt, and eventually, after a series of weird events, he would eventually become very powerful, and his brothers would come to Egypt because they need food, because of famine, and they don't recognize him at first, and so on. You have that back and forth, and eventually that does happen. But Jacob actually gives us an insight into this, that the sun and the moon represented the parents, Jacob or Israel and Rachel, and the stars represented the children of them. So you had 12 stars in total. Joseph himself would be the 12th, and you have the other 11, which are the brothers. And now, is that vision directly tied here? Not directly. We're not referencing Joseph's reign. But what it does do is it gives us one of, if not one of the only cross-references we would have to explain what these symbols mean. You're simply not going to find other. The only other mentions of stars and the sun and the moon in eschatology is in reference to when the sun is turned red like blood and darkened, and the moon is turned red and darkened, and the sun is darkened and turned black like sackcloth, and the stars fall. But that, I don't know how that would be in relation to this. But as it ties to Israel and symbolism, this would actually be a direct cross-reference. And on top of that, and I'll read this one myself, but in Jeremiah, there is something said, and this was one of the first things that kind of came to my mind when I was reading these, because I thought it sounded familiar to me. In Jeremiah 31, God is going to reiterate his promise to Israel. Because one of the challenges in eschatology is the promise is given to ethnic Israel, literal or figurative, does it represent the church, and there's a whole debate. Well, one of the promises God gives to Israel is found in Jeremiah 31. In verse 35, he says this, Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar, and the Lord of hosts is his name. If this fixed order departs from me, declares the Lord, then the offspring of Israel also will cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth be searched out below, then I also will cast off all the offspring of Israel for all that they have done, declares the Lord. And then he goes on to explain how he's actually coming to victory at the very end of this chapter. But I thought it was interesting that what God does there as he ties the fixed order of the sun and the moon and the stars to his promise, that because these would not change, so his promise to Israel also would not change. And he adds a clarifier. He says it's not just going to change because these don't. He's not going to forsake them because of what they have done. Because that is one of the primary arguments given by preterism, is that because of Israel's constant, excessive rebellion over and over, culminating in their rejection of their Messiah, God finally had enough and cut them off. And now it's actually the church, and it's been the church the whole time. Except, not only is that said to be not the case here, Paul reiterates in Romans 11 that God did not cut them off simply because you were all that. But we've dealt with that one a lot. So, this imagery of the moon at her feet and the sun and the stars is actually not entirely unheard of, and just adds more to the pile of the fact that this has to represent Israel. So, now we've gotten that detail out of the way. Now we get to the big one, the dragon. See, the woman, not much is said about the male child. He's born, and he's going to rule the nations, and he goes up to God on his throne. He doesn't really show up again. The woman herself is mentioned again at least a couple times here. She's mentioned at the beginning, and she's mentioned again at the end, and then she kind of disappears. She doesn't show up again either. So that leaves one other character in this chapter to look at, and that would be our main character. The main character of this chapter leading into chapter 13 is the dragon. We are following his point of view. We follow him into chapter 13. It is him who we see on the seashore who calls up the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth, and we will see him again. The people of the earth worship the beast and they worship the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And the dragon is again seen when the kingdom of Christ arrives and he is cast into the abyss. And we see him again as he's pulled out of the abyss. And he leads the nations again in Gog and Magog and is again cast in the lake of fire. So the dragon we see repeatedly after this point. And so he, in this context at least, is our main character. He is the reason we are looking at this vision. And so, now that we understand the basic theme of the vision here, we have the birth of Christ from Israel and the dragon's desire to destroy him. We now can set the tone for what this vision is about. The dragon is both the devil and also a government. He is clearly described as being Satan himself in verse 9, and we will get into that a lot more next time. We'll get into some of the specifics about the dragon and his function and his history, but for now, will suffice to say that this represents the devil. He is seen as a dragon or a serpent. This wording doesn't simply mean a dragon as we would think of it. The term dragon can be used a couple different ways, but we might think something more akin to medieval or perhaps Chinese-style dragons. But it's not quite the idea. It's similar, but not quite the idea. As much as it can be referred to a very large serpent, and perhaps even a sea monster consistent with the imagery used in the Old Testament. For example, the Leviathan. It's a large monster or dragon. This would be consistent with the fact that the beast seen in the next chapter looks a lot like the dragon, and he comes out of the sea. And when the woe is given, it is given from heaven saying, "Woe to the earth and to the sea," because the dragon has been cast down. And so I'm not going to obviously harp too much on that, other than to say that it has something particular in mind here. This is not just a snake anymore. This is a dragon. It is a large, somewhat sea-looking beast, and I don't know if you meant to do this, Becky, but kudos for not adding legs. Because if you go back to the Garden of Eden, what was the condemnation given to the devil as a serpent? You will have your legs removed and you will crawl on your belly. So, there you go. He doesn't have legs. I'm not going to harp on that. I'm not going to come up with imagery for that. Again, I don't have a way to answer it. But I did think it was interesting. So here we have this dragon, but he's a large dragon. He's a mega dragon. Again, we have the term used again. We have a great sign, a woman clothed, and we have another sign appear in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon. He is a mega red dragon. He is very large in size. And he's red. It really seems to narrow this down. Now, some say, well, this represents bloodshed because he was a murderer from the beginning. Maybe it does. We're not told that. I'm not going to run with that. If I were to be asked to come up with any kind of possible guess as to what this represents, the color red is interesting because if you go into the next chapter, the beast from the earth, or the beast from the sea, which looks a lot like this, same number of heads, same number of horns, he will also conquer the nations. All right, that all sounds pretty well and good, except we're never given his color. We're given some aspects. His mouth is the mouth of a lion, and he has the feet like a bear and the body of a leopard. All right, well, that's similar to Daniel 7, but we're never given what his color is. The dragon is the only one we are given a distinct color for. My best guess, and I am just throwing this one out there, so do not hold me to this, but he's not just the devil. Here we see the imagery of heads and horns. Heads and horns represent nations and the things that build up the nations and the leaders that come from those nations. And nations doesn't just mean a formalized nation as we would see it. It means a domain, a kingdom, a rule. And so, for example, and I'm not, again, this is just throwing as an illustration, but if you wanted to describe America, you could say you had a beast with 50 heads. And on those heads each are, a governor and what's the term? The deputy governor or whatever, the assistant. And so you can say, they have 2 horns on each head, right? This kind of gave me a rough idea of what's in view here. So if I were to say, well, is there any large governing body that is generally categorized as a red dragon, what comes to your head? And I'll leave it there, and you can run with that as you please. But that is the interesting part here about what makes the dragon unique. He is a red dragon, a governing body, and he himself, what's interesting about him, is he is not ever seen as himself ruling the nations. He is seen as a conglomerate of national identities, and he will give authority to the beast so that he can rule the nations, but it's never quite described in this way as the dragon. It's almost as though he uses them and kind of picks and chooses different pieces to ride along, but he's not necessarily interested in himself doing this. But we'll get to that at a different time. So we have a great red dragon, and he has 7 heads and 10 horns. If we're consistent with our rules of interpretation, this would mean that the dragon does not simply represent Satan as a being, but even includes his influence over governance in the world, taking the form of a governmental entity per the rules of interpretation given in Daniel and in Revelation. This description is almost exactly the same as the beast from the sea in Revelation 13, indicating that the devil is consistent in his structured governmental influence. Because if you keep in context, notice how the dragon never changes form between when the birth of Christ is seen and we see him again in the future. He stays the same. And when he makes the beast from the sea, which is his almost like peak project, it's like his project he's been working on, and when he gets to the sea, he calls it up. He opens the garage door, as it were, to let out his project and demonstrate it. And it looks like him. This is his apparently preferred style of governance, or at least his best that he can come up with. And so I thought that was interesting to see the consistency there. But that means it's consistent between the birth of Christ and up to the future, creating a new government body in his likeness. But more will be said on that next time. But here's a challenging one, and this is one I could not quite narrow down. There's one part of this image that you might find missing. He's got a tail. A lot of discussion about what that represents, but the tail does something. There are, let's say, I'm going to draw circles because I'm not good at drawing stars. We will say, here we have really ugly-looking stars. So we have stars, and the tail of the dragon comes up, and he sweeps away 1/3 of the stars. And the wording that's used is the tail drags 1/3 down. So out of the stars, 1/3 of them are dragged down to the earth via the tail. What does that mean? Well, there are a couple options that I will give to you, and I will leave it to you to try to come up with it. This is a very fascinating one because there's one other text that you can use as a cross-reference for this one, and that is Daniel 8. The little horn rises up exceedingly, even up to the host, and he causes some of the host of the heaven and the stars to fall down to the earth and tramples them. What does that mean? Well, have fun with that one. But I will give you some options to consider here. This, fortunately, is not super consequential. This is not mentioned again in Revelation, and it is more used in the description of the dragon. So this is what we have. One, and the most popular conclusion, it represents angels turning into demons. This is a consistent interpretation that I have seen frequently. You probably all know I guess I'll call it mythology of the devil, where he was an angel of light and a cherub around the throne, and he led a rebellion because he was jealous of mankind, and he wanted to be like God, so he led a rebellion, and he and his angels that he got on his side were kicked out, and those angels became demons, and those are represented by the stars here. I have some issues with that mythology, but we will get into a lot of that next time. But many say these represent angels turning into demons. This is the most common conclusion as to the meaning of this text. In essence, the idea is that the dragon, or Satan, has brought down 1/3 of the angels in heaven down to the earth. These are things that would validate the meaning, so there are some ideas to this, and there is some value to it. We know that angels sinned and are waiting for the day of judgment, seen in Jude 1:6, and they did not keep their proper domain, and Luke 8:31, where they are pleading with Jesus not to cast them out in the abyss before the time. This interpretation would mean, if we're going to be consistent, that these angels would have been brought down to the earth as demons around the time Christ was born, per the timing of this text. This could be substantiated by the fact that we don't really see demons as we understand them until the New Testament, and could potentially be a tactic of the devil to bring down a sort of ground force to the earth in the same time God himself was coming down. That's the best I could run with it. If these represent demons being thrown out of the earth, and we only ever really see them showing up in the New Testament around the time Christ shows up on the earth, then that would make sense why they're seen visualized here. The problems is consistency of interpretation. If the 12 stars on the crown of the woman represent the 12 tribes of Israel, then why all of a sudden do stars now mean angels? Which is it? Do they represent tribes of Israel or apostles if you're preterist, and then suddenly they represent angels? It's the same word used. It doesn't change. There is also no text which explicitly refers to the angels as stars, outside of maybe Revelation 9:1. Some people have tried to infer that it means it, but there's no direct statement ever making that claim. So we would effectively be changing the meaning of what stars represent in the exact same chapter and context based on outside conclusions. One moment they represent people, the next they represent fallen angels. So that would be my initial problem with that. So what's the other option? That they represent saints. If we are to be consistent as possible and interpret stars to represent the elect, in this case the 12 tribes of Israel, it would solve one problem while creating another. It solves the problem of consistency of our hermeneutic, as it would be intact, and would lead us to conclude that the stars represent the elect saints, and the stars on the crown of the woman narrow our focus to the elect Israel via the 12 tribes. This would also have some textual backing, since the saints are referred to as being like stars, or lights, like in Philippians 2:15, for example, and even more specifically used as referring to Israel, like in Hebrews 11:12, and as we mentioned in Genesis 37. With our understanding of the meaning of the word angel or messenger, it could also be referenced back to the 7 messengers, or angelos, who were to deliver the messages to the churches in Revelation. What are the problems with this handling? If this is referring to an event around the time of Jesus' birth, we don't really have a particular thing to point to where the devil cast down a third of the saints. In other words, this is a detail given wherein we have nothing really to tie it to as an event that I'm aware of. This is not a singular reason to write it off, it just is a practical issue. So I had to deal with that one because it's in there. The final other option is that the tail taking down the stars simply represents power and reach. That he was so powerful he could even take down the stars to indicate how far his tail was, as far as a large dragon. And then Daniel 8 is a challenge in and of itself that I won't get into today. Now, why is he being brought up? What's the point here? And we'll kind of go through this quickly. What's the point of this? Why bring up the dragon and the woman and giving birth to the male child in Revelation of all places? What relevance does this have here, and why is the dragon a main character? Well, this is why certain details, like the life and ministry of Christ, appear to be glossed over. The woman and the child are not the focus of this text, but rather serve as details in the life of the dragon and his intentions. He will be the one who summons up the beast from the sea and the earth. He is the one who gives all of his power to the beast of the sea and subsequently the man of lawlessness, and he will be worshipped in part because of these things. Unlike the beast from the sea and of the earth, the dragon will not immediately be cast into the lake of fire. Instead, he will be bound in the abyss for the 1,000-year reign of Christ and will later be let out before being cast into the lake of fire finally. And on top of that, the lake of fire was designed for the dragon and his angels. It was designed for him. Unbelieving people go in there, but it wasn't originally designed for them. And so this has helped to put in perspective the fact that here we are dealing with, for lack of a better term, the big bad guy. We are now introducing our primary antagonist into Revelation. So the scene, we have a play. What's this portraying? It's portraying conflict. We are witnessing a play which shows the conflict between elect Israel and the devil. There's a constant effort on the part of the devil to harm or destroy Israel. And when the Messiah, who would come through the nation of Israel, came along, the devil sought to destroy him right out of the gate. From the very beginning, the devil has been fighting against God. From the Garden of Eden, where he deceived Eve, to his attempts to deceive even Christ himself after failing to destroy him. He has sought the destruction of Israel countless times, often getting very close. Their enslavement in Egypt, deception leading to rebellion in the desert, invasions from other countries like Babylon, who went much farther than they needed to, and even the conquerors from Rome at the time when Christ was born. He is constantly trying to get rid of them, because the nation of Israel represents God's sovereign choice. That despite how hard it seemed the Israelites tried, God would never truly forsake them, which is why they persist to this day. And when you see in the news the nation of ethnic Israel living on their geographical promised land, and people are trying to annihilate them, understand that this is still playing out. We are still seeing this to this day. He is behind all attempts to destroy them, including things like the Holocaust, things like the Six-Day War, and other such events where he actively and consistently tries to destroy the people whom God made his covenant with through Abraham. He has been at this task even to this day. He has been allowed to get very close. And when we get to the very end, he will be as close as he has ever gotten. They will have been pushed back to the very corners. He has killed 2/3 of them. They are pushed to the brink to the extent that the last bit of them are called a remnant, the leftovers. He will get so close. In this particular text, we are now zeroing in on him. We have described God's judgment, the day of the Lord, the great tribulation, the particulars from God's point of view of how he is judging the nations and the legal reasons behind it, and the means how he does it and what it represents and the scale. But now we're going to break from that and we're going to zero in on the dragon. And we're going to zero in on the antagonist, the villain, the enemy. I mean, what does devil mean? It means adversary. But this is not an adversary. This is the devil. This is the adversary, the serpent from Eden, the one who was there at the beginning. We have seen him at the beginning, described as a serpent, and we see him at the end, described as a serpent. We see when he first deceived and when he is no longer able to. And so we're following him now. We've gone from the grand scale of the day of the Lord, and now we're going to zero in on the antagonist. And then after that, we're going to zero in on his primary tool, the beast from the sea. And then after that, we're going to narrow down to the capital of the beast from the sea. We're going to narrow down to Babylon. And we're zeroing in, describing both the intentions of the enemy, the plan of the enemy, and the reasons and means by which God defeats the enemy. So we're zeroing in. So we're starting, going all the way back to the birth of Christ, to explain who we're talking about. In particular, we start by looking at the time when Jesus was just about to be born. The image of the dragon waiting to devour the child is quite obvious as to what it represents. Where we have a census issued by Rome, and Jesus being born rather last minute, Herod was seeking out the child so that he might have him killed, even attempting to deceive the wise men, ironically, into giving away where he was. This would culminate in the death of the children 2 years and younger, sometime 2 years following his birth. In that event, Joseph is warned in a dream and flees with Mary and the child to Egypt until the death of Herod. So, pretty clearly, we have, right out of the gate, the devil trying to get the child destroyed, to the extent he's willing to kill plenty of other children to get to him. What other interesting thing to me stands out about that is how pragmatic the fulfillment of prophecy is. If you had read about the Messiah coming, you would have heard, well, he will be born in Bethlehem, he will be called out of Egypt, but he will be called a Nazarene. You would have debated, well, how does that happen? Is that symbolic? What does that represent? Well, what ended up happening wasn't that Joseph was sitting there in Bethlehem and thought one day, he's supposed to be called out of Egypt. I guess let's get up and move. He was forced to go. He was afraid of what Herod was going to do. Herod was certainly trying to get the child killed. And by necessity of the enemy's paranoia, because the dragon tried to kill the child, he inadvertently funneled the child into Egypt, thereby fulfilling the prophecy that God had already planned out. His attempt to destroy the child ended up playing exactly into the plan. So, don't we think that's going to happen again? In the sense that God's fulfillment of prophecy doesn't just pop out of nowhere with no particular context. Oftentimes, the fulfillment of prophecy, I find, is the pragmatic solution to a particular problem. It doesn't just pop out of nowhere. Some series of practical events that you would not otherwise notice lead to that. So even when we look at the news today, well, that's not eschatology, that's not supernatural. Well, it doesn't have to be. It is weird, but we don't have to deal with that today. So in this particular text, we are zeroing in on the events surrounding the birth of Christ and the devil's plan. So now let's look at the timing. It's clearly historical. This is clearly looking at the birth of Christ and mentions his ascension, but it happens quickly. We're kind of glossing over that because we're following the devil's motives. So we're going to fly over that. This vision covers the birth of Christ, the dragon's attempts to destroy the child, and the child's ascension in heaven. Obviously, it is moving quickly, but as mentioned previously, it's because we're not meant to focus on those particulars. Instead, he tries to go after the woman. Now, this is where it gets particular, right? We've been glossing over things up until this point. There are only 2 mentions of time in this text, and they're very specific. If I say 1,260 days, and I say time times and half a time, that should really ring a bell, because this is not the only place those are mentioned. The challenge is that they're mentioned twice, so what do we do with them? So, this occurs at 2 instances. The first time is the dragon wishes to destroy the child. He is unable to, the child's taken up, so he can't do that anymore. So, before he can go after the woman is herself taken to her place somewhere designated for her. She is taken there, and she is primarily meant to be kept there for for 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years or 42 months. Now, this happens after the ascension of Christ. That begs the question, what does that represent? This is certainly one of the more confusing parts, because it narrows down where this could possibly occur. Based on the speed of the events happening thus far, we've covered 30 years pretty quickly. We're not necessarily bound to conclude that this event occurred immediately after the ascension, though it's not likely to be long after either. We understand that Rome would eventually destroy Israel as we know it during the Jewish revolts, culminating in the events around 70 AD, which Jesus himself alludes to in Luke chapter 19. He talks about how you have the Jerusalem, and they're pointing out the temple, and he weeps over Jerusalem and over the temple, and not one stone would be left upon another. And sure enough, not too long after he's gone, the Jews decided to revolt, and they started leading a rebellion, and Rome has enough of it, and they come and they corner them. And in 70 AD, they demolish the temple. They destroy a lot of the city, and Jews are defeated. So we know that that's coming. Jesus alludes to that coming. And we have an early church historian by the name of Eusebius who refers to this, and he says, because one of the questions I had was, okay, well, the woman, she can't necessarily represent all of ethnic Israel, period. There are reasons for that, one of which is that not all ethnic Israel, in the sense of not every Jew who is alive all at once at a certain period of time, are saved. 2/3 of them are killed before we ever get to the salvation. He will save the remnant, which means he first purifies and purges, and we've gone over that. Revelation or Romans 11, not all who are born as a descendant of Abraham are saved. So God refines them. And in this case, the woman in view is being kept and saved and nourished, and so it's in view here of elect Israel. So the question I had was, all right, are there any elect Jews in Jerusalem around 70 AD? And what happened to them? We know there was a church in Jerusalem. This is repeatedly mentioned throughout the New Testament. So what happened when Rome surrounded? Eusebius gives an interesting account where he describes how in the early church they knew that the Romans were coming, and they heard and they had read that Jesus warned them about the coming destruction. And so they anticipated this. And he claims that they had received a message from Christ or from some miraculous message telling them that Rome was on its way or that things were about to go down and to get out. And so they fled the city, and they went into an event now called the Flight of Pella, where they fled up northeast into a city called Pella, which is just on the other side of the Jordan, on the other side of the Valley of Jezreel. And so the next question I had was, okay, they fled somewhere right before the Romans laid their final siege. One of the things they point out in history is that the Romans initially started to lay siege against Jerusalem, but for some unexplained reason, they pulled back, they retreated. And then they came back and they finished the job. And there's been discussions and debates as to why that happened or even when exactly it happened, but it happened somewhere right before the final siege. It's debated as to whether it's 66 AD or 66 AD or sometime earlier or later. There's a debate. But all that to say, they're not really sure of timing. So let's say the church is warned during this break or an opening appears, and they're told to get out right before the Romans finally destroy it. The Romans' destruction of Jerusalem occurs around 70 AD. So I thought, all right, well, let me ask, when did this early church, or how long did they stay out of the city? So I asked the question to ChatGPT, because I was curious, because there's a lot of resources, and I just wanted a general answer. And it said, most historians generally agree that the early church returned to Jerusalem somewhere around 73 AD. Not exactly sure why. The church would return to Jerusalem only to, again, leave somewhere around 136, I believe it was. But they return. They're not gone very long. And there's debate as to when they fled and when exactly they came back and why, but one thing was generally agreed upon, that they didn't stay gone for very long. And so I thought it was interesting that here we have Christ descended, and the woman is taken to her place in the wilderness. It's not in the populated areas of Israel. It's not in their normal place. She is taken to a place where she can be kept safe or nourished, sustained, for exactly 3.5 years down to the day. So, what could this have in view? My answer: the early church, before the destruction of Jerusalem, was taken out and brought to the wilderness, where they stayed for exactly 1,260 days before returning. Why does this matter? What difference does this make? We say, well, we know the Bible is always going to be fulfilled, so why tell us this? Why not just tell us about the future? I mean, this is clearly one of the events this text is narrowing us down to. It does not gloss over this point. It glosses over Christ's earthly ministry. It just skips right from his birth to his ascension. But this, it suddenly focuses and says, hey, pay attention to this spot. She is taken to a designated place somewhere in the wilderness and is there for exactly 1,260 days. Well, what are we told later in the same chapter? There's war in heaven, the dragon is cast down, he realizes he has a short time, so he goes after the woman again. And what happens? 2 wings of the great eagle come and they take her again to her designated place where she was kept for a time, times and half a time, which is the same period of time, 3.5 years, but described differently. Okay, well, what does that mean by implication? So if she goes there again, we can then deduce, all right, well, she's going to have to flee. The dragon is cast down. He knows he has a short time. He's about to call up the beast from the sea. He's about to call up the kingdom of the Antichrist, which means we're looking right at the tail end of events now. We're right before the Great Tribulation. Well, can you think about the Great Tribulation in a time when people in Israel specifically are told to flee? Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now, the question's always been, where in the mountains? Well, I asked, let's take Pella. If she goes back to the same place she went to before, then we would assume that she's going to go to the same place. If we can identify that place, we can get a rough idea. And so I asked, is Pella by chance mountainous? And sure enough, it is fairly well known for being a fairly mountainous and hilly terrain. In order to get there, you have to cross through mountains, and you have to cross through the Valley of Jezreel. And so what you start to see from this text, even if it's not Pella, right? It could be somewhere else. I'm not going to be dogmatic. But the point that it's making here is that there was somewhere in particular that God had designated for the elect Jews in Israel to flee to, and they will do it again. And wherever they went to, they will go back to. And so when Jesus is telling those who are in Judea, the day of the Great Tribulation is about to arrive, go and flee, they're not just being told to flee anywhere. They're being told to flee to a place that has been designated for them for this purpose. Now, we know other Jews will still be in Jerusalem. That's how the purging occurs. There will be plenty of unbelieving Jews still left in Jerusalem who will not flee. What's interesting even about today's events, the West Bank consists of what is often called occupied territory by the UN, and in that occupied territory, which is under heavy dispute, is Judea. And so you see a series of particulars that are being brought up and then reiterated. So here the dragon is, and he wishes to destroy Christ. He can't do it, so he goes after the next best thing, Israel. He wishes to destroy the people that God had promised his covenant to, and the reason which the end of the age is coming, the people who God will save. And so he's going to try to go after her again, and he's not allowed to go after her in particular. We'll get more into those specifics next time. But suffice it to say, we're being given specifics. So here we have the flight where they're fleeing to a specific place. And if this is actually the event in mind, it would explain the meaning of this event. We're being told that the woman is taken away. She is kept safe to a specific place. She is kept there for some reason, only 3.5 years each time, never more, never less. And by the way, one of the things I thought about, I drew a map. I pulled up the map and I thought, okay, let's say hypothetically, they do flee there. So let's say they go to a designated place in the wilderness and they're going to go there again. All right, if that is around the time Jesus tells them to flee, which is right before the Great Tribulation begins, we know the Great Tribulation lasts for a time, times and half a time, 3.5 years. And if they flee to Pella, which is to the northeast, just on the other side of the Valley of Jezreel, by the time the Great Tribulation is coming to its end, they will be leaving. And in order to do that, they have to cross up the mountains where they will have a first-hand view of, again, the Valley of Jezreel. The Valley of Jezreel has another name, the Valley of Megiddo, otherwise known as Armageddon. So here you have the nations of the earth gathered into this valley to destroy Israel at the very tail end of the Great Tribulation, and these people who have fled there are now just coming out of their hiding place to see the nations gathered against Israel. You have now set a very interesting scene. So what's the meaning? The dragon will again be cast out of heaven. It's going to happen again. And that's where we're building up to. We are building up to him summoning the beast from the sea. We're building up to the Antichrist. We're building up to the kingdom of the earth that he's going to have, and we're leading up to it. He has a conflict with the woman. He desperately wishes to destroy the woman. That is his target. He wants to get her. He's not allowed to. So when he's not allowed to, and they're kept safe here, so we're for some reason given the specifics about their exact place, at least the amount of time they're kept there for. We're being told that, so you could almost view it as all the pieces are kind of being nestled into a specific spot to make sense of things. What does the dragon do when he can't get to the woman? It says he persecutes those who keep to the testimony of Christ. That's at the very end of this chapter. That's what he decides he's going to do. So what's his first step in doing that? He goes to the sea, and he summons his masterpiece. Beast from the sea arises, who will overpower the saints, and will overcome them, and he will rule the nations for 42 months. We are building up to a climax here. We're building up to the key description of the antagonists and their motives. And so this dragon is effectively, he knows his time is short when he's cast out. This is his last-ditch effort. This is it. He has singled his focus down. This is his last move before the kingdom of Christ arrives. So we are being given the background, the context. When you see the news and you see conflict with Israel, this is just a sort of small little echo of something much, much bigger coming along. Next time, we will describe the dragon. We'll get into some specifics, some controversies, his history and his motives and his person, and then follow him in to chapter 13. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the time and the glimpse we are given. And even though it is a challenge, you've given us specifics so that we could understand. And I ask that we take that seriously, that we have been given these things for a reason, and that we look carefully into your word to understand why, what they mean, and what we're supposed to do with them. I ask that we consider very carefully the fact that these things are still in motion even to this day, and that your plan, even if against the enemy's better desires, is being worked out. I thank you that we are given these particulars and we are given these signs, even if we don't know what to do with them all the time, so that we can know that this is being worked out, that there is a plan, and that the enemy is falling right into it. We thank you for these things and for this glimpse. In Jesus' name, amen.